Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Anthea Sellis, and I am the Secretary General of the International Council of Archives. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the International Council of Archives Week Climate Change and Documentary Heritage, a Call to Action webinar, which is co-hosted by the International Council on Archives, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, as well as the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA. So before I introduce our speakers, I just need to let you all know that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the session. And please note that this webinar will be taking place in English. And we are able to take questions, and we will actually be using an interactive platform. So I'm going to share my screen right now so that you can see it. An interactive platform called Slido. And we're going to ask you to log into Slido right away, because it is one of our first things that we're going to be doing as part of this webinar. So here is Slido. You can access it either via your web browser at Slido, so sli.do, or you can actually get it downloaded onto your phone and in the application. And what you do then is, this is the code here. I'll also get it up so you can see it. So it's #archivesclimate. So if you could log directly into that right now, so that we can get you participating on one of our first interactive questions. So, and these questions were put forward by our presenters here today. And so in 5 words or less, what does climate change mean for archives? So we're going to ask you now to fill in your answers on the poll. And while the poll is being completed, I am going to introduce one of our first speakers. So Emilie Gagnet Leumas is a PhD accredited archivist and accredited records manager, who is the chair of the International Council on Archives expert group on the emergency management and disaster preparedness. She is the director of archives and records at the Archdiocese of New Orleans. Emilie has received national and international recognition for her efforts in disaster recovery after Hurricane Katrina. She has participated in recovery efforts after local and regional disasters, especially those related to flooding in South Louisiana. She's presented conference papers, facilitated workshops and seminars on subjects including disaster recovery, risk management, salvaging sacred objects, archives management, and records management. Here we go. Okay, so we're starting to get some answers in. Only 2 answers. Oh, come on, audience, you can do better than this. Let's see. What other things do you think, in 5 words or less, does climate change mean for archives? So we've got so far higher cost, risk management. Do any of the speakers want to talk to any of these particular points that are being raised?
I will. I think higher cost is maybe something that in the beginning you look at that it's cost, but the risk that is reduced actually is cost savings. So it depends on where you're putting your money. If you're putting it in the planning and the preparation and the mitigation, then you're reducing the cost for the response and the recovery. So to me, you have to look at it for its cost effectiveness and where that, as we would say, ROI, rate of return, and the investment. What are you getting from that investment?
Okay, so we got a few more answers. Yay, yay. So we've also got prevention, need for proactivity, transformative change, a treat and a danger, mold infestation and damage. It is a really big challenge. Training, setting priorities, making choices, silica, dots. Maybe that means something, the dots bit to some of our speakers. More detailed disaster planning and management of risk, because we dealt with the higher cost question. Do any of the other speakers want to say something before we move on to the next slide? Nope. Okay. So moving on. So what measures do you have in place to prepare your institution for the impacts of climate change? So you've got a couple options here, and I'll scroll down so you can see all of them. You have nothing prepared. Staff have participated in workshops or seminars. Risk mitigation team through the building. Fully worked out disaster manual, and other. Okay, so go. Let's see. So now I'm going to introduce Andrew Potts. So Andrew is the coordinator of the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group of ICOMOS. The group is working on a variety of initiatives in line with ICOMOS's view that cultural heritage constitutes an invaluable repository of information and strategies to address climate change, even while cultural resources are at risk from climate impacts. ICOMOS serves as a secretariat of the Climate Heritage Network, and Andrew coordinates this work as well. So it's all happening on the poll. It's just like watching a race. Let's see, what do we got? So most people have participated. Looks at this point, most people have participated in workshops and seminars. So that's really good news. I think that's great to see. Let's see, we've got nothing prepared is in a close second. Risk mitigation team through the building. That's really great. Let's see, we've got other. So maybe we'll see if we still got 53%. We still got staff have participated in work and seminars, and we've got 18 answers so far. Get your responses in. It feels like a race. I feel like I'm calling like one of those horse races. All right. This is great. So it looks like most people have at least participated in some seminars and some workshops, which is good news.
Especially if you count this one.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone should be at least ticking that box. They're here.
So that's brilliant. Okay. So voting is closed now. Thank you very much for everyone who participated. We had 21 answers. That's great. So I'm hoping we're going to get more answers, though, on the next question. So what measures do you have in place to prepare your household? So can you work from home? Are you able to deal with interruptions to water supplies? Are you able to deal with interruptions to electricity supplies? And anything to do, are you prepared for an evacuation? So now I'm going to move on to our last speaker, but definitely not least, and that's Mr. Stephen Wyber. Stephen is a manager manager for policy and advocacy at IFLA, where he is responsible for both work. He's responsible for work both to promote libraries and their interests within international discussions and to strengthen advocacy capacity at all levels. He and his team work across issues from copyright and climate change to human rights and the need for meaningful policies for preservation and conservation of heritage. So I think all of us have had loads of experience with working from home now, which is good.
Also.
Especially since most of us are doing this, I think, from our respective homes, or at least we're back in the office at ICA. So thank goodness for that. So dealing with electricity supplies, that's interesting that nobody's ticked that one yet. And now somebody's going to tick it though, I'm sure. So really interesting to see the different levels of preparedness, I guess, in our homes when it comes to preparing for disasters. Because I think, Emilie, when we were talking about this, I think one of the things you observed is you really, as a practitioner, you're really no good to anybody if you can't show up and you can't protect yourself as part of this process. So we can't forget about our important role in terms of doing disaster recovery and emergency preparedness.
Be interesting to know if dealing with that interruption in electricity supplies is just candles. You know, that people have a way, or candles and flashlights, or actually a generator. Yeah. Here in South Louisiana, many homes have a generator that they can at least plug in so that their refrigeration can, you know, it certainly won't keep the house cool, but it will at least allow you to keep a few appliances running, especially your refrigeration.
That's brilliant. Well, it looks like like I said, most of us are ready to work from home. They hit the top of the poll. But it's you know, I think it's really promising to see that people have ways of dealing with interruption of water supplies and now interruption of electricity supplies has now moved.
Maybe when I said candles, it took them up a little bit. Oh, a candle and a flashlight.
Well, that's great. We've got 30 answers on this one. This is a great response. Like I said, everybody, please make sure you log on to Slido. So it's, if you want the website, it's sli.do, or you can download it. You can go to your app store and download it as well. So we use it a lot at ICA. So if you're going to participate in any other of our webinars, please do make sure you've got it with you. So you had 31 responses. So 87% working from home. What measures do you have in place to prepare your household? 29% dealing with interruption to electricity supplies, 19% dealing with interruption to water supplies, and 16% for an evacuation. So really interesting results. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the poll. So now we're going to move on to a talk from each of our different participants here on the webinar, and we're going to start with Emilie.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from me, good afternoon to others, and good evening to those that are further along in the time continuum of the earth. I'm going to talk today about the beginning of what we think about in emergency management and disaster preparedness. On this slide, you will see that there are many ways that we are affected by emergencies and disasters themselves, from fires to flooding to all types of things that have to do with climate change as well as natural hazards. And I'll get into that a little bit further into the slides. One of the things with the expert groups and working groups for the International Council of Archives, there are several different groups, and the Emergency Management and Disaster Preparedness Group was established in 2015 because it recognized that ICA needs to be part of the discussion on documentary heritage and protection, and having experts in the field to be able to answer the questions from the archivists around the world. The goals and the objectives of the expert group is to coordinate initiatives and exchange good practices in the field of emergency management and disaster preparedness. We also facilitate professional mobilization and archival solidarity when disaster strikes. We've been able to respond and help facilitate in this area, not only in the Pacific, by running some workshops there, but also in the Caribbean, having, after Hurricane Maria, being able to respond and help the islands in the Caribbean region form a new group that's called the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network. So that's been part of what we've done. The other thing that I've done is I've been able to go into Suriname and work with government and archival and cultural heritage stakeholders in beginning to look at disaster planning and disaster manuals. So what we do, I've touched on this a bit. We provide training and workshops. We do research and make available the existing resources in different languages, and we're always trying to add to that. So if anyone has a really good resource in any of the languages of the global community, we certainly would ask you to let us know about that. We assist in the compilation of disaster plans and case studies for future dissemination, and we advocate for the protection of cultural heritage patrimony. And we do these things in multiple areas, as I discussed before. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. There are four major components to any type of emergency management and disaster preparedness. Most of the time, when we dive into this, it's at the response. We haven't started on the preparedness or the mitigation, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there usually is a catalyst for change. And that catalyst usually happens because there is a disaster or there is an emergency. And the response happens in short order. People are quickly trying to gather supplies. They're trying to figure out what collections have been damaged, which ones need to be evacuated or moved to a different facility in order to do the correct recovery for those records. Recovery can last anywhere from a week to 10 years or more. Recovery is getting the institution and the archives back to a better place, that it's fully open and it's fully back to being autonomous. Response is having probably very little in being able to be active and be open to researchers, et cetera. And it's the recovery stage that really gets you back to, using my mother's expression, getting you back to go, and getting you back to being fully fully into your normal day and your normal practice. On to the next slide, please.
All right.
That's all right. So you're really looking at a comprehensive emergency management program. When we're going to talk about mitigation and prevention, this is what we'd like to see on the front. This is where we actually should start. Most of the time, as I said, we start with response and recovery, and then we start thinking about how can we put in best practices to make sure that moving into the future, we don't make the same mistakes. What are the lessons that we've learned? Right now in this global pandemic, we're all now having to move very quickly into working from home. And we've had to make tremendous adjustments. And what's coming from that is better resources, better ways of working from home. Zoom, as we all know, has become a product that people thought no one was going to work. It was going to take 10 years before we actually got to everybody being virtual. And in a very quick, short order, we were all virtual by way of even this webinar that we're all on today. So mitigation and prevention, we now need to look at how are we doing those things as we move forward. Can we do the next slide, please? So what is risk management? Risk management is the identification, the assessment, and the prioritization of risk. We want to be followed by the coordinated application of resources to minimize, monitor, and control the probability or the impact of unfortunate events. So in risk management, what we're doing, we can do this on a simple level all the way to a much larger level. You can look at risk management is, when was the last time you went around your building and made sure that the fire extinguishers were up to code, that they're not laxed by 5 or 10 years? Sometimes in a facility that doesn't have a fire specialist that's going around and checking those things in a building, you put a fire extinguisher in, but you haven't gone back to check it. So there are things that we do. When was the last time? I mean, I'm looking over my own head, and years ago, I'll point, if I don't know if everybody can see it, there was a leak in my ceiling. Well, that's been taken care of, but it hasn't been repainted over. So when I do my webinars lately, I sort of point out the fact that that strategy has happened, and right now the pipes have all been redone in my ceiling, but that's a mitigation. What have I done that I've walked around my facility? For my home, I walked around because we're getting ready to go into hurricane season, and the trees around the property needed trimming because in a storm, they will blow over and they will damage here. So it's that sort of thing. It's from looking at it from both the inside and the outside of the facility of what can we do to make sure that we're controlling that impact as best as we can. Next. So these are the type of natural hazards and that are affected by climate change. When I started this, I grew up in South Louisiana where hurricanes are always a risk. And what we've seen, my father was a meteorologist, so I had osmosis knowledge of weather. And hurricanes have always been part of our lives. I heard recently on the news as we were waiting for Tropical Storm Cristobal, they interviewed a gentleman and they asked him in South Louisiana if he was getting prepared. And his comment was, "I'm not getting prepared because that's too late." He said, "We in South Louisiana live prepared." And when I heard that, I thought that's something I need to start using. I'm going to steal that man's 2 words, live prepared. So in climate change, with everything escalating from the hurricanes and cyclones getting much more intense, the flooding, the coastal flooding that we're seeing because sea levels are rising, wildfires. We see what's happening in Australia because of drought, and things are getting or heating up around the globe. Ice storms. People, you hear people, well, we've had an ice storm, so how can that be global warming? Well, there is a relationship between the two. And of course, drought and other things that affect those natural hazards. So we need to think about that as we're doing that. In our risk assessments, we need to assess and prevent and protect the needs of both the institution and the collections. We want to look not only at the immediate and local threats, but take that broader view. We don't want to limit ourselves to just the immediate environments that we're in. We need to identify and assess the potential risk to the collections. We need to conduct a risk assessment. And that's what I was talking about, going around that building and also looking at your collections and looking at both internally and externally how we can better protect and mitigate against those risks. I put a source down here. There is, FAIC has a risk evaluation and planning program. This is just one of many, but I just wanted to include at least something. There's also D-Plan, and we can talk about that, but there are other plans that are out there that are readily available if you want to conduct these types of risk evaluations and planning programs. So we want that risk to go down. We are never going to eliminate risk, but mitigation will allow us to lessen the effect. We'll never get rid of it, as I said, but we do want to lessen it. So to implement those appropriate measures, identify the risk, start with activities that will most affect those that in your area. Some you will be able to eliminate, some you'll be able to lessen, and others you'll never be able to address. I can't address what's happening in the sea, and I can't address the fact that hurricanes are coming and getting greater in strength and earlier. Tropical Storm Cristobal was a perfect example of storms that are arriving much earlier in June rather than waiting till our August, September, when that's the height of our season. So no telling what we're going to get this season. We want to develop a list of tasks to be accomplished. One of the things I always advise people is look at the three things that you can mitigate against in short term, this week, this month, this year, and be able to put together that information. Install and improve your alarm system, fire, water, intrusion, security. What do we look at in improving the systems that we already have in place? This is not our disaster plan. It should not be, help, help, and that's it. I always put in a funny in one of my slides. I have a couple of others funnies, that break the glass and then there's nothing in there. But this is one that I try to push to help people realize we can't just stand there and do nothing. So what are the traits of a good disaster plan? We need it to be well organized. We need it to be relevant and practical. We need to tailor it to the institution's geography, the users, and the priorities. I live in South Louisiana. An ice storm is not going to affect me, so I'm not going to prepare for ice. However, we could have a freeze that could potentially give us some trouble, but not near as much as flooding will here in South Louisiana. Your disaster plan needs to be broad-based. You need to have a lot of staff involvement. One person writing a plan and trying to push it out to everyone is not going to have buy-in and have people at the table. It needs to be widely distributed and read, and it needs to be reviewed and updated at least annually. You want to test that plan. You need to map out a disaster scenario. Run through the response and the recovery steps. Even if it's something very small, do a tabletop exercise. What happens if it's during non-working hours? Where's the contact list? How do you get in touch with your staff or maintenance or any of the facility workers that need to come in and help because something has happened in the facility? The service providers. Who are your electricians, your plumbers, your roofers, etc.? You need to close the reading room and limit services. What does that look like? reviewing the response time and the standards, and then amend the plan if necessary, and then test some of the cleaning and drying supplies that you have. We use, in the United States, we call them garbage bin. We call them a garbage can. In the UK English, it's the rubbish bin, but we actually have those that are on rollers that we put supplies in. My staff knows that if you go into that supply bin and you get something out and it's not during an emergency, that you will have to answer to me because we need to make sure that those supplies are there when we need them. We need to make sure that the batteries are still good. We need to go in. Right now, we actually pull the mask, the N95 mask out of there to both donate and to have some available to our staff if need be. So that will have to then go back into resupplying our own disaster bins. Oops. That's okay. So yeah. So in conclusion, and I have a couple of conclusion slides, we want to be preparing for and responding to a disaster. It's never easy and it's never quick. Risk assessment, mitigation, disaster preparedness, and response plan need to look at the creation, the response, and the recovery, and it significantly increases our chance of recovery. During 9/11, when the buildings came down, the people that had their backup servers in the basement, many of those companies, besides losing their entire staffs, had lost all of their data. So we need to look at where do we have our, what is the best way that we can have that chance to recover? And we want to work with our first responders. You want the fire, the emergency management, and the safety to be part of your team ahead of time. There's nothing like knowing who your fire people are and having your fire department, having them come into your facility, serve them, you know, milk and cookies or tea and cakes, and because you don't want them that the first time they've come into your facility or visited your facility is during a disaster. You don't want to meet them for the first time and say, "Hi, I'm the archivist for the Archdiocese." There's some real important things that are in this building when they have no idea what that cultural heritage is to the region and how important it is. So here are some final thoughts. You need to be vigilant. You need to be patient. This is not something that happens overnight. You need to be prepared for surprises. By taking courses and by being active participants in the process, you will be ready for those surprises and you'll be able to be creative when what you've learned doesn't work and you've tried it, that you can then turn around and do something different. Take specific recovery workshops. You want to know your collection. Collection management is crucial, and if we had hour, we could talk about that. But target your collection. What if you had to evacuate? What could you put in a van? What 10 boxes would you grab to put in the trunk of your car? What one box, if you could take, what would it be? Or what one document is the document that you want to make sure is forever saved, and make sure that it's backed up properly. Know your maintenance staff and your IT personnel. They are some of your greatest allies. Take nothing for granted, and of course, always maintain safety. Human life is most important. The collections actually can wait.
Thank you so much for Emilie. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emilie. Thank you for presenting that. Really informative. Albeit brief, I know you do much longer presentations, and that was really great. So now I'm going to hand off the mic to Andrew Potts.
Hello. Good morning where I am in Albany, New York, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone else. Anthea, first, let me thank you and the International Council on Archives for organizing this important session. On behalf of ICOMOS, let me say happy International Archives Week to everyone. As Anthea said, my name is Andrew Potts, and I coordinate climate change and cultural heritage for ICOMOS. For those of you that don't know ICOMOS, it's an international NGO based in Paris dedicated to the safeguarding of cultural heritage. And ICOMOS also has the pleasure of serving as the Secretariat for a newly launched network called the Climate Heritage Network. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. So I've titled my talk for today, What does cultural heritage look like when it's part of the solution to climate change? And by that, I mean, what do cultural institutions look like when they're mobilized for climate action? And what does your own professional practice look like when you're actively helping to tackle climate change? And that's whether you're an educator, a curator, an archivist, a librarian, a conservator. We all can play an important role in addressing climate change. Before diving into that topic, though, maybe I should step back a little bit and first address the question of why. Why should each of us view climate action as part of our job? Why should cultural institutions view climate change as part of their mission? I would argue that addressing climate change is not only part of the mission of cultural institutions, it's mission critical. In general, our job in cultural heritage involves preserving and conserving for the future the records, the memories, the stories, the places of the communities we serve. And climate change is an existential threat to those communities and their cultural heritage. We know from science that human activities are producing unprecedented concentrations of greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases are warming the planet, changing the climate, and increasing the hazards that we face. And Emilie gave you a good catalog of some of those hazards that are being accelerated and increased by climate change: sea level rise, changing seasonality, more storminess, desertification. As a result of these dynamics, in 2017, my own organization, ICOMOS, concluded that climate change had become one of the most significant and fastest growing threats to people and to their heritage worldwide. That was 3 years ago. Unfortunately, since then, the trends have only worsened. I don't know how many of you saw in the news, but last month, May, was the warmest May ever recorded on Earth. And the last 12-month period, the hottest 12-month period ever recorded on Earth. That's according to the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service. We all will recall painfully that 2019 was the year that the world burned. We remember the deadly wildfires that raged from Australia to the Amazon. It's the Earth's oceans which absorb much of this extra heat. And in 2019, we saw the heat content of the oceans reach record levels. As oceans warm, they expand and the seas rise. And in 2019, the global mean sea level reached its highest value since the beginning of modern record keeping. And so climate change, it's not a future problem. It's not a problem our kids are going to have to deal with. It's a today problem. That's the right slide, Anthea, thank you. So as you think about those threats and think about the risks that Emilie mentioned, I want to just stress one basic fact that I'd like you to keep in mind. And that is that these threats, the threats from climate change, are anthropogenic, meaning they're caused by people. So we're not talking about threats like volcanoes or earthquakes, where we're waiting to see what kind of risks the Earth sends us. In the case of climate threats, the magnitude of them depends on the net amount of greenhouse gases we continue to put into the Earth's atmosphere. And when I say we, I mostly mean those of us that live in industrialized countries. And so if you're asking, how much will the seas rise near my building? How many days over 38 degrees centigrade do I need to plan for in the coming years? To know the answers to those questions, you have to make some assumptions about the success or failure of our efforts to decarbonize, because these things are correlated. The Paris Agreement's goal is to hold global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. In 2018, the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us that if we can hold global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, so even more ambitious than the Paris Agreement targets, then the impacts of climate change will be more manageable. They told us that every degree of warming matters. There's a big difference between warming of 1.5 degrees and warming of 2 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, science projects that most of the warm water coral reefs on the planet will die. At 2 degrees of warming, all of the coral reefs on the planet die. It's a world without coral reefs. And to bring it down to the scale of our institutions, another thing that climate science tells us is that the more warming there is, the less likely it is that the measures that any of us can take within our own institutions, the types of responses that Emilie talked about, the less likely that those measures will actually be successful, because every system has a limit to its adaptive capacity, and at some point those limits will be overrun. Currently, there's a big gap between where we're headed and where we need to be, and so whether we beat the Paris Agreement targets, I would argue, is mission critical to our basic job of safeguarding cultural heritage. Actually, back one slide, Anthea, if you could. Sorry, I'm a little, there we go. There's another reason I'd argue that our institutions need to engage on climate change, and that's because cultural heritage offers immense potential to drive climate action and to support just transition by communities towards low carbon, climate resilient futures. So I would argue to you that if the places our institutions serve are facing an existential threat, as we are in climate change, and if we have the skills and we have access to information that can help our communities face that threat, then we have an ethical and a professional duty to do so. And so for those reasons, I would argue that engaging on climate change is mission critical. Now, one of the things I've been trying to stress is that cultural heritage is a part of the answer to climate change, and I want to delve into that a little more. Next slide. As I said, climate change is an anthropogenic problem caused by humans. And so in turn, solving climate change requires cultural solutions. It calls for impressing upon people the need to plan with a multi-generational time horizon. It demands circular economy approaches that promote the reuse and the conservation of resources. Solving climate change demands creativity, it demands knowledge and information, and it requires communicating at a human scale, connecting these issues to the things people value. For those of you, my fellow colleagues that work in cultural heritage, I hope these themes are sounding familiar to you. To me, they describe the core considerations of cultural heritage. Next slide, please. And if there were any doubt about what cultural heritage, documentary heritage can contribute to climate action, last year ICOMOS issued a report called The Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Action. There's a shot of the cover on the screen now, and also a photo of the lead authors of the report. The report goes through each section of the Paris Agreement, and it scopes out how the things that we're good at in cultural heritage can contribute to achieving each of the key ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And yet we still have too many ministries of culture, too many library and archive agencies that aren't involved in climate planning, that don't sit on the climate action teams of their mayor, their premier, their governor, their nation. We have too few national, regional, and municipal climate plans that even mention cultural heritage, too few museums and archives that include climate change in their programming, too few facilities managers that know how to downscale a 20-year climate impacts model, too few traditional knowledge bearers and indigenous scientists who are invited to the climate science table. So how do we shift this paradigm? How do we increase the ambition of arts, culture, and heritage to contribute to the work of climate change? And how do we convince the realms of climate science and climate policy that we have something to contribute? Next slide, please, Anthea. This is where the Climate Heritage Network comes in. The CHN aims to connect culture and heritage to global climate science and policy. Its members have committed to using cultural heritage to aid communities in achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. To help deliver on that result, in 2019, at COP25, which was the UN Climate Summit for that year, the CHN launched its Madrid to Glasgow Arts, Culture, and Heritage Climate Action Plan. The plan consists of 8 activities. It's things like creating new tools to help communicate the connection between cultural heritage and climate action, offering insights to policymakers on how they can valorize traditional knowledge in their work, and developing strategies for mainstreaming cultural heritage into climate planning. It's an ambitious agenda for a newly formed network, and we could use your help. I'd be remiss at this moment if I didn't take the opportunity to invite your universities, your agencies, your archives, your research organizations to consider joining the CHN. Both ICOMOS and Stephen's organization, IFLA, are founding members. To learn more about the network and how to join, you can go to www.climateheritage.org. Last slide, please, Anthea. So to conclude, we've heard over and over again now that our governments, our communities have to do more to address the climate change challenge. We have to rise to the occasion. Our world has a greenhouse gas emissions gap, and I would argue that that emissions gap is caused by an ambitions gap. And all this despite the fact that collectively we've been working on climate change for a long time now. So why do we still have this gap? What haven't we tried? Who's missing from the climate action table? I'd argue we're missing. Our sector, cultural heritage, is missing. Not all of us, but broadly speaking as a sector, I don't think we've been fully mobilized for climate action. So what I would suggest to you that the cultural heritage sector is one of the missing elements needed to close the emissions gap and close the ambitions gap. What I'm hoping is that as a result of this program and other dialogues that we as a sector, we in the cultural heritage field, archives, museums, libraries, heritage sites, will commit to be missing no more. Cultural heritage is a climate change issue. Climate change is a cultural heritage issue. At the CHN and at ICOMOS, we'd love to work with each of you to use what we're good at in cultural heritage to be a part of the solution to climate change. And thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a really compelling talk and a really good call to action. And I think ICA needs to sign up. That's what I think right now.
We would love that.
Excellent. So moving on. So we now have our next poll. So I'm asking everybody to get back on Slido. Before we get back on Slido, I'm going to pull up the code again for those of you that may have just joined us over the course of the webinar. So the code for Slido is #archivesclimate. So Slido is sli.do for web browsers. And if you have the application, then just type this in, #archivesclimate. So our speakers are asking, beyond disaster risk management, on what other areas are you already programming? So here are your options, ladies and gentlemen, and get on that poll and get your answers in. So is it retrofitting your institution's older buildings for energy efficiency, meeting higher standards in newer buildings? So that's option 1. Option 2, allowing access to data in your collections to support climate change science. Number 3, allowing access to records about past practices to inform contemporary climate action. Or number 4, making space available for climate action. So everybody get your responses in. What are you doing aside from disaster risk management on areas of public programming? So while I'm letting people fill this in, I'm going to talk a bit about something we've been doing here at ICA for a couple of years. We set up something called the Disaster Relief Fund, and Emily, jump in if I miss anything here. So it was set up in 2018, and it was really sort of inspired by the SAA's work when they set up their disaster relief program. And we did it after the devastating hurricanes, in particular in the Caribbean in 2017. The fund provides small grant monies to any repository that holds archival records or special collections, monies that may be used for direct recovery of damaged or at-risk materials, such as services as freeze drying, storage, transportation of materials and rental facilities, supplies including acid-free boxes and folders, storage cartons, cleaning materials, plastic crates, and protective gear. So the gamut of whatever you need in order to do disaster recovery. It also provides advice and assistance via consultation with experts to archives repositories seeking information about response and recovery. For this particular disaster relief fund, we do not require anybody to be part or an ICA member. This is really core mandate for ICA and the important work that we do in terms of protecting documentary heritage and protecting archives. So if anybody has faced, has a disaster that they are trying to manage and you need access to funds in order to secure your archives, your archival collections, please do reach out. You can reach out to Emily, you can reach out to myself, or you can reach out to anybody here at the ICA and we will get you in the application form and we can explain the process to you, which is pretty light touch because we really want to get that money to you to support collections. And did I miss anything, Emily?
Nope, it's very small grant money, so it's not, you know, you're not going to get 10,000 euros to be able to rebuild your program. Unfortunately, I wish we had that type of funding. So I would, on both ends, if you're having a disaster and you need some help, we can provide some small funds to be able to get some supplies to you, or that you can get some supplies yourself. I'm here if anyone has questions about that. But the other thing that, you know, we always, I hate always doing this, but begging for money. So if you're not in a disaster, but if you'd like to contribute, there's always that button that you can send us 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 euros or on up, so that we can continue to be supportive of those that are in the middle of crisis.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So it looks like we're getting a good response, and it looks like there's a lot of people who are retrofitting their institutions or older buildings for energy efficiency and meeting higher standards in newer buildings. So that's really great news. We also have people holding lectures and events around climate change, which is really great. And then in third position, we've got participating in broader networks around climate action. And then finally, 34% allowing access to data in our collections to support climate action. So that's really great and really good information
Yeah, very
for our
interesting.
speakers to share. And I'm sure we will continue the discussion as well as we join the Climate Heritage Network. So did any of the speakers want to say anything about the results before I pass off the baton to Stephen? Okay.
It's certainly on my side only that effectively, fortunately, you're already doing things I'm going to talk about. So I can go quicker. That's good.
All right, so I'm going to hand off now to Stephen Wyber from IFLA. Over to you, Stephen.
So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to Anthea, to Christine, and to Marie-Paula and the ICA team for organising this and for inviting me along. Thank you to Andrew for the nomination, for your intervention, of course to Emilie as well, and of course happy Archives Week, International Archives Week. I'm sure some of you may be aware of IFLA. I know that we share quite a lot of members with the International Council on Archives. IFLA, is the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, is the global library organisation. We focus both on promoting improved professional practice through standards, through sharing of best practice, but also obviously, as mentioned at the beginning, through trying to advocate ourselves for libraries at the global level and build capacity. And clearly climate change is one of those issues where it's been excellent to work with Andrew in the past year or so now, I guess, in order to discover, to highlight one of these key issues where libraries are affected and where libraries and the broader documentary heritage community needs to be part of the calculation, but also where we have something to contribute, and so where it's really important that we stand up and we're heard. So what I'll be trying to do very much is go into more depth on the subject of documentary heritage and climate change, partly because, as Emilie set out, documentary heritage can be particularly vulnerable to damage from extreme weather, from accelerated degradation over time linked to changing climatic and atmospheric conditions, but also, and picking up on what Andrew started to talk about, because documentary heritage can also make a really powerful contribution to climate action, that we can really be players. We do not, and this is paraphrasing a line that was used at the official launch of the network in Edinburgh last year, that we can really be not victims, but vectors of change. So what I'll try and do in my presentation is look first at the role of heritage in informing our responses, our understanding, in particular, the role of records of past practices in informing sustainable lifestyles and preventing permanent loss of heritage and its consequences, but also what we can do as institutions today, both through our collections, but through who we are, through our buildings. So this is the right slide for this. Clearly, much of our ability to understand how dramatic changes we're seeing today has only been made possible because we've actually kept those records over a long period. Andrew mentioned that climate science we keep on coming up with examples of how this has been the hottest May since records began. It's been the hottest year since modern instruments were developed. The fact that we can say these things is down to the work of documentary heritage specialists maintaining these records. Now, clearly, this is what we do, what librarians, what archivists do in supporting centres of learning and research. through government records. Governments are a fantastic source of this sort of information. And of course, individuals who've kept a note of what's going on, who've kept an eye and have kept records and donate their collections. Clearly, a big challenge for us now, and this will be shared across the library and the archive field, is how can we make sure that all this information is digitized and it's shared so that we really can enable climate science to build on it, to develop conclusions and to explore evolutions over time. So it was already good to see that around 30% of respondents were already actually doing this, making this data available. Next slide. Now, clearly it's not just about pure data. It's very easy to think that all we need to do is look at how many degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit it was in June of this year and of the last year and of the last year. And of course, this is important. Temperature records, sea level measurements, measurements of rainfall, etc. is very important. But just because something isn't numerical, it doesn't mean it's not data, and it doesn't mean it's not useful. And so increasingly, we're seeing an awareness that documentation like travel records can be really useful. For example, the National Library of Scotland is already realizing the potential, because these can underline the sorts of weather that people have experienced, especially outside of the urban centres where scientists tended to be based. They can tell us where the glacier reached 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and build up a sense of melting. It can tell us about the size of lakes, where they reached, where they didn't reach. Other features, at what time of year the crops were growing, were harvesting, or were failed. Ships records, and in the middle we have a little image of one, is also useful in terms of calculating the size and frequency of extreme events, wildlife that existed, of course maps as well. These are all materials, really valuable sources that are only here because of the work of libraries and archives. Now, clearly, what helps with this is that all that we do around preservation, all that we do around making sure that things are in context, that they're understandable, is vital. Of course, it's not always 100% easy. Certainly speaking from the library side, a big challenge for us currently is how do we present this information? How do we work across disciplines? Because certainly climate science has really posed a challenge. You can't just look at it from the physical side, from the meteorological side, from the environmental side. You really need to be able to work together. And that's a bit of a challenge for us. Next slide. It's also worth underlining that documentary heritage doesn't just need to be a way of understanding how terrible things are and how much better they were in the past. They should also be a source of ideas and inspiration. And again, Andrew mentioned this briefly, that there is so much out there. There are so many traditional approaches to production that we can learn from, for example, in agriculture, in building, even in diets. In the past, sustainability concerns, the risk of the fish or the lobsters running out, was a much more pressing concern when you couldn't just go down the market or go down the supermarket and buy one from another continent. And so traditional approaches, where these have been documented and researched, often have this much stronger focus on sustainability, and we can learn from them. Also, documentary heritage professionals have a vital role in ensuring that the heritage of people whose livelihoods and homes are at threat from climate change. This is a really vital role. We know in particular that often it's people who are already vulnerable or marginalized who will suffer most. We have a role in documenting, in preserving, in maintaining and giving access to, according to ethical principles, in order to, of the documentation, in order to ensure that the physical dislocation that many will suffer and many will be compelled to make does not lead to cultural or societal dislocation and all the costs that this will bring. As Andrew suggested, there is an existential threat to much of our culture, but if we act, if we collect, if we preserve, then we can do better than nothing at least. And finally, and again drawing on something that Andrew mentioned, there's the role of heritage in making things real. We know that data will force many people to switch off, that statistics cause fear. However, when you can tell those stories, when you can illustrate what's happening, this is a great way to ensure acceptance and engagement, to make things relevant to the things that they value. Next slide, actually. That was you read my mind. The timing was excellent. So then, beyond the collections, certainly in the library field, there's a growing awareness that we can do more. The collections are the draw, but we also have a space. We have so many other things that we can do. And also in doing so, we can build on the reputation that ours are institutions that people come to in order to get the facts, that people come to when they're uncertain, when they want to find out what's going on or what they might want to do. The library field has a well-established green libraries movement, which focuses a lot on using the potential of our buildings as exemplars, retrofitting, new builds. Also in our operations, how can we be greener, reduce our own emissions? Even as a shop window, we see great examples around the world of libraries stepping up as centres to build awareness, understanding and action, inviting in experts, as seen in this photo from Ireland, promoting sustainability literacy, holding events around relevant collections, really proactively sharing what climate change means for institutions, which are all about taking the long view, and in doing so to raise ambition among people and hopefully among governments. And of course, I'd hope that we can also get involved, and our contribution to networks is going to be really valuable. And so definitely I would encourage you, echoing Andrew's point, Andrea, Anthea, to join the Climate Heritage Network, because it's been a great way of creating this momentum. And so, final slide.
Oh yeah.
I'll try and get that. There we go. So I think, as Andrew said, there's a real opportunity to step up. There are so many people, I think, we're in fields where people generally do have, in inverted commas, a social conscience, an awareness that you want to do something for society. Add to that the fact that documentary heritage, all heritage professionals can do something concrete and positive, as well as, of course, looking out, making sure that we're not losing things that are irreplaceable. There is so much that we can actually do. And so hopefully when we come out of this, and there'll be another question shortly, we will see a lot more people thinking about, well, what is it that I can do, not just to protect my collections and protect what they contain against climate change, but actually invest proactively in climate action. And just on this final page, clearly you have my email. I also wanted to include the email of my colleague Claire Maguire, who leads on cultural heritage within IFLA, and who is also extremely heavily involved in the Climate Action Network. And so if you do have questions on the documentary heritage side, please feel free to contact Claire as well as myself. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. And so thank you again to all of our speakers, Emilie, Andrew, and Stephen. So I think we got a really good overview of practical approaches to help us protect our collection. Definitely a call to action. So we, the documentary heritage and cultural heritage network, really need to mobilize ourselves. And I think the power of our collections is really well illustrated in Stephen's presentation. And to be, as you said, Stephen, that vector of change. So it was a overall, all the presentations were fabulous. So one last poll, then we'll move to Q&A. So please do get onto Slido. You have all the details on the left-hand side of your screen there. So what are 3 things do you think that you can do in the next year, so participants, to ensure that your institution is better engaged on climate change? So those of you, the 117 people or so I see on Facebook Live, what do you think are the 3 things you can do over the next year to ensure that your institution is better engaged on the climate change issues? So get your responses in there. I'm going to let you answer, and then I'm going to talk about a few more things here. So just a reminder about the Climate Heritage Network. So this is the page, the web page for the Climate Heritage Network. And here is the join button. So I hope that many institutions, as I said, ICA will be joining. And you can hold me to that now that I've said that in public, to join the network. You also have here on the ICOMOS page, if you want to read the article, or the report rather, Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage and Climate Action. Do take the time to read that really important report and the work that our colleagues over at ICOMOS have done to get a sense of how we can engage our collections in how to support reduce climate change, and also reflect as well on potentially how we as our institutions and as archivists just more generally, how we can reduce our impact on climate change. And last but not least, just so that members are aware, the Records Management Journal currently has a call out for a special edition called Records Management in the Anthropocene, Pathways and Challenges Presented by Climate Change. So we posted this on our on some of our, I believe it's Facebook and Twitter, but I'm sure if you go onto the Emerald Insight, which is the journal that publishes Records Management, the Records Management Journal, they will be able to, you'll get more information about the call. The extended abstracts are due June the 18th, so very soon. So please do get your, if you want to write about climate change, or you want to write about the work that you've done in climate change and records management, please do take the time to submit your abstracts. So I'm coming back. Okay, we've got one answer. So to what are the 3 things you can do? So we have rethink index terms, link up with Climate Heritage Network. The message is out, Andrew. And think about our institutional footprints. First, read Future of Our Pasts. Also update our disaster plan and create a dedicated set of disaster response supplies. Next answer is energy efficiency review, renew longstanding green group. Oh, all the answers are coming in. Yearly update on emergency plan, emergency test, review policies and procedures, revise and improvise if necessary, engage and train staff and stakeholders. To name a few, so somebody's ambitious. Standard and guidance, budget or funds, and collaboration, constant education, getting together, collaborate when doing prevention, constant promotion of climate change issues and status. So you got some good responses here that are coming through. I don't know if any of the other speakers want to jump in. I'm just doing the running commentary at this point. So there's address, go ahead.
Just to say, it's really positive to see the mixture both of efforts to adapt and to get used to and to better prepare for risk management, but also actually find ways to be greener ourselves.
Absolutely, completely agree. And it's something I think I feel, at least the Secretariat General, something we need to reflect on as well here at ICA. And we do have blog posts, I would say, on some of these topics. So do get on to our ICA blog and have a read as well. Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
That's all right. No, it was me. One of the things, when we talk about simple things, call to action, and I did mention when people were talking about emergency management, in your collections, identifying which collections are critical collections, not only in having information on climate change, but also those that need to be protected. One of the things that we advocate for is using glow-in-the-dark tape, so that if there are certain boxes that need to be evacuated, that you can get to them when the electricity is out by just shining a light and knowing where they are. And also marking in your floor plans, knowing where that is, because if the team can't get in, sometimes the first responders can, and you can point them, go down this aisle, you've given them a plan, and then you can say, shine your light and find the 4 boxes that have glowy green stickers on them and bring those out to me. So that is a very simple thing, but it's something that we can all do readily as we identify the collections that are critical to be able to evacuate them.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Emily. That's really useful information for everybody who's joining us. I think the messages have definitely gotten across from all 3 presentations. So, and I think that continuing to work together moving forward will be really great as well. So I'm going to move into the Q&A section so that we can see if we can pick up some of the questions coming from people here. All right. So I'm going to throw this out to the speakers. So what is your strategy for reducing risks in the event of natural disasters? And do you have an updated code of good practice? Who wants to take this one?
I guess I can. Reducing the risk, you're not going to be able to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases in the way that the sea level is rising and the temperature coming down, and not contributing to that is one way. But also on reducing the risk within your facilities, it's to manage making sure your collection easy. Don't have your collections on the floor in the basement if you know that sea levels are rising and that you're going to be in one of those areas that's going to be affected by that. So for me, it's being prepared, and again, using that tag, living prepared, making sure that our spaces are adequately ready in the event of a natural disaster, and what are they that are within our area geographically.
One thing we try to stress at ICOMOS is that it's not sufficient anymore to simply rely on past experience, on past experience about weather, about storms, about humidity, about temperature. That's the change in climate change. These things are changing in ways they've never changed before. And so one thing that we strongly recommend for folks that are doing medium and long-term planning is to downscale the climate models for your site, for your buildings, and take the projections of future humidity, rainfall, temperature into account, because in the future, they're not going to be like they were in the past. And so nobody should be doing medium and even certainly not long-term planning without looking at the models. And if you don't have the capacity within your own organization to downscale those models, in almost every community, there are institutions that are doing these things. And so partner with them.
That's really great advice. Thank you, Andrew. I didn't think about that. All right, so, so we've got an electronic records question now. But in the case of electronic documents, are there disaster simulations for document retrieval?
Where are they stored? I know, where is the redundancy? Is it, we used to talk about, is the disk, when we used to have disks, the backup disk, is it next to your desk? Is it in the cloud? What are you doing to check to make sure that that information is retrievable? And I think that's really the test. You have to partner with your IT and make sure that that information in whatever data center, whether it's an on-site somewhere in the field, or whether it's in the cloud, how do you then test that? How do you then say, I need to find this document, is it still readily available? And what happens if the system goes down? We all have hiccups in the system. IT has had to make sure they go back on their disaster recovery, in pulling back email or in a hiccup in the system and the documents were gone for that day and they had to go back the day before and regenerate back up. So, I mean, those are the ways that IT can help you test the electronic documents and the storage of them, and making sure they're migrating forward in platforms of the way that they used to be. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to the next question. So what do you think about, for some people, the technology in itself is a potential for disasters? So for example, carbon emissions because of the excessive use of electricity, or data centers because of huge, all the use around, I'm thinking in French now, air conditioning. That's the word I'm looking for. There we go. We get there eventually. So what do you think that there's just something we need to consider as a community, the impact? Because essentially when it comes to digital, we're going to need bigger and bigger centers for documentary heritage institutions in order to care. And even I would say for museums as well, as we get more and sites, as we have to care for these sites, as we have to care for these things. So is there an impact on some of our practices in order to do our work?
Yeah, it's a good question. Powering the cloud, powering the internet is surprisingly energy intensive. I recently saw a study that compared it, looked at the amount of energy it takes to stream a video. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the stats, but an average person's in the global north, their video streaming habits are equivalent to running a refrigerator. We're running a kitchen refrigerator for a whole year. And so it's material. Part of the solution will be greening the grid. If the energy that we're using to power server farms and the internet comes from wind, comes from solar, then it's somewhat less of a concern. But as long as we're using fossil fuels to power the grid, it's a problem. And there are efforts to look at how to reduce the energy intensiveness of the cloud. Content heavy, video heavy pages, streaming, there are practices that are more energy intensive than others. And if the grid stays dirty, then I think it will be a question of how are we using technology, how are we using the internet, and how much energy is it using?
So I think is there perhaps a call then to some, I'm thinking specifically as an archivist and trained as a digital archivist around when we have to start preserving at scale these all these volumes of digital information. It's sort of looking at, I think, perhaps a call to us to start looking at more energy efficient ways then to preserve the materials that we're caring for ostensibly as well.
It can be material, yes.
Okay. What do you think about dams' effects on climate change and cultural heritage?
Yeah, I don't. Emilie may have thoughts about first of all, dam infrastructure is under stress from flooding, from precipitation. We've seen dam failures around the world because of changing precipitation patterns. So there's certainly a hazard mitigation dimension of it. At the same time, dams can be sources of hydroelectric power, and that can be a good thing, although the net benefit of hydro is something that's being debated. To me, what the issue makes me think of is the point Stephen made about the displacement of whole communities. The World Bank estimates that something like, I won't get this quite right, but something like 100 million people will be displaced because of climate change impacts. Thousands of communities are currently located in places that aren't going to be viable for human occupation in the future. And so, and you see this with things like dam failures and flooding. And so it's a great point Stephen made, that we really have to think about frontline communities and how do we preserve and conserve their stories amidst even planned relocation and diaspora.
That's good. Thank you. So next question. So we've got 2 more minutes left. So whatever questions we don't get to, we will come back to them. I'll ask our panelists to answer them, and we'll post them on the ICA blog so that you can read them. So is there any guidelines made by ICA or international organizations to respond to the disaster for records?
I guess that's for me, huh? So I'll go ahead and answer that. ICA currently, the Emergency Management Disaster Preparedness expert group, as well as the training officer, Margaret Crockett. Both Margaret and I have been developing a workbook to be used by ICA and archivists and anybody else that is trying to protect documentary heritage. The plan is for the workbook to be available in 2021 to be published by ICA, and to also within the LMS, the learning training system, that they will also, the learning modular system, learning whatever
management
it is.
System.
There you go, learning management system. That there will also be a course that will follow as well in the workbook. So look for 2021. There are some good things happening, and there is publications that will be coming out, and there will be courses, and there will be other areas that we are addressing as we continue every year to do training in other areas of the world.
Thank you, Emilie. So last question. So how can archivists predict the disaster in the future? For example, the rise of sea levels. Are there any tools or software available? And that'll be the last question we're going to take, and then we'll take the rest of them offline.
Well, yeah, I alluded to this a moment ago, but a number of institutions, including the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, NOAA, the UN, maintain climate models, and they project scenarios. The scenarios depend on how good of a job we do at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The worse the job we do, the worse the scenarios get. But those scenarios, those models can then be downscaled for any given GPS location, any given address. Increasingly, the ability to downscale those models and take account of them in infrastructure planning and in facilities planning, et cetera, it's a kind of a baseline requirement of doing any medium and long-term planning. Many institutions now regularly do this themselves. It's not incredibly complicated to downscale a climate model, but if it's not something that folks in your institution are familiar with, there are invariably in government, in other institutions in your community, partners who are doing this. And so I'd recommend partnering with them, decide the data set that you like, and figure out how to downscale the scenarios for your given addresses.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to thank everybody for joining us on Facebook Live. And like I said, I'll ask our participants here, our speakers, to help us answer the other questions. And like I said, we'll put them on the blog as soon as we can. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time today. I really appreciate you sending us over, giving us your expertise. And I think based on the Facebook posts I've been watching on the side here while you've been talking, we've had some great feedback from everyone, and everybody's found this really, really helpful. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely day, a lovely weekend. And don't forget, we've got 2 more webinars, one on Saturday tomorrow on archiving social media, and then the last one on Sunday with our new professionals about the future of the profession. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Okay. Thank you.